You rotten bastard! How could you do this to me? It's all your damn fault! The string of blasphemies from my wife's lips seemed endless. I have to look back sometimes to think how I ended up in this uncomfortable position that too many men find themselves in over the years. I, along with thousands of other idiots, tried to squeeze into a subway station during rush hour. I've been told there are worse places in the world, but London is as bad a place as I would ever want to encounter. I moved out of Greater London years ago because it's too crowded for me. I like the peace and quiet of the West Country where I now live. Don't forget that it can get very crowded during the summer vacation. During the 6 weeks of school summer vacation, I try to stay away from my town. That day I had to visit my employer's main office, something I usually avoid if at all possible. But it was destined by the powers that be. Since I took over as manager of our small factory, productivity has reached unprecedented heights. The fact that, unlike our previous manager, I left people to do the work they knew how to do, rather than demanding progress reports every 5 minutes, was not realized by the pen pushers in the head office. If those guys knew what we were doing with all those little notes they were sending us, I'm sure they would have fired me. Anyway, I was making my way to the front of the platform when something made me look to my right. Perhaps I wanted to see if a train was coming, but a face showed in the distance, and for a moment my heart stopped beating. There, in the distance, stood Sandy. I thought it was her. It had been 10 years since I'd seen her. I tried to head in her direction, but at that moment a train pulled into the station, and any chance of shortening the distance between us vanished. I could almost see Sandy enter the next carriage to the one I was standing next to. Because of the crush, I had no chance of reaching the car Sandy had entered, so I squeezed through the nearest door. The doors closed with some difficulty and the train pulled out of the station. Squeezed among the other travelers, I could only wish that one of them was Sandy. I first met Sandra in elementary school. Even then, she was already the prettiest girl in the class. I wouldn't say everyone thought so, but I did. Okay, I guess it was a high school crush. Sandra, as everyone called her then, was the first girl I ever really got to know. My older brothers teased the local girls relentlessly, and I was painted with the same brush. Of course, Sandra and I were never together on the playground during recess. Little boys who drove around girls were soon branded as wimps. But in class, we inevitably sat together and helped each other with our work. Sandra and I were always chosen to be the classroom supervisors for everything that went on, from handing out milk to getting and putting away sports equipment. For 5 years in elementary and junior high school, we were together most school days. And we always went home together, much to my brother's dismay. But in year 11 came a big change. The summer we moved to middle school, Sandra's parents moved. Not very far away, but to a different neighborhood. After that summer, we went to different schools, and it was about 6 years before I saw her again. I could tell now that it was a Wednesday night. If I looked it up, I could tell you the date. The Pinner Fair is a one-day event that has been held every year since some king issued a decree authorizing it. There are quite a few towns throughout England that have one-day fairs. It's a must-attend event. The center of Pinner is blocked off, and the high street is lined with all the trappings of a fair. The big wheel, the wall of death, the merry-go-rounds are all put up overnight to run for one day only. The next morning, it's all gone. I persuaded one beautiful girl to come with me. My only regret now is that I didn't go with my brothers. But at 17, the old hormones were doing their thing. Anyway, I stood there, my dream hanging on my arm, by the Wurlitzer, and waited to be loomed over like grim death. You know, that's why you take girls to the Wurlitzer, so the girls can pretend to be scared and you can grab them real tight. Me and my girlfriend got into hell, I can't even remember her name. Anyway, when the damn thing started moving, that very face floated in front of me. I immediately realized who it was, and I also realized that I wished I was alone. What the girl I was with was thinking, spinning her head around, trying to determine exactly where I saw Sandra, I'll never know. But what I will say is that I think our date went downhill. When the ride slowed down, I finally found her. As my date and I were getting out, I saw Sandra getting into another car with her girlfriends. To my companion's disgust, we waited until the Wurlitzer stopped again and Sandra got out. A tense conversation ensued, during which Sandra and I said, "Hi," pretending we had no attraction for each other. We tried to act like old platonic friends, but I'm afraid we weren't very good at it. After Sandra left with her little company, my date asked me how long I had been in love with Sandy, as she had come to be called. "Sandy is just an old friend of mine from grade school," I told her. "Yeah, and I'm Brenda freaking Lee. Look, if you want to walk me to the bus stop, I don't mind getting home on my own. I'm not stupid. I recognize love when I see it, even if you don't see it." That girl and I searched the fairgrounds for the rest of the evening, but we still couldn't find Sandy and her friends in the crowd. Needless to say, that was my last date with that girl, but I am forever grateful for her foresight and patience. After all, she was the one who told me that I was in love with Sandy. Sandy and I were not to cross paths for another couple of years, and as it was, Sandy just faded into a painful memory. So I tried not to think of her too often after my first desperate but unsuccessful attempts to track her down. I wasn't as resourceful then as I am now, and finding someone in a city of over 6 million people isn't easy. Through the phone book, I tracked down her father. Although he wasn't the easiest man to talk to, I learned that his wife had left him for another man the year before and had taken Sandy with her. Over time, I managed to get the name of Sandy's stepfather from her father. But by the time I tracked him down, Sandy's mother had moved again. And by the time I tracked down her mother, she went back to using her maiden name. Sandy apparently got fed up with her mother's behavior and left home. I thought perhaps Sandy's mother had a drinking problem, as she was as angry as a newt when I called her home. She claimed she didn't know where Sandy was, but from the state she was in, I think she was having trouble remembering where the damn door was. When I returned to the house a few weeks later, hoping her mother was sober enough to tell me where I could find Sandy, there was no furniture in the house, and a "for rent" sign hanging outside. The landlords told me they had evicted Sandy's mother for non-payment of rent. All further attempts to locate her were unsuccessful. One evening, I was in a pub a few miles from my home when I saw Sandy's face in the crowd again, this time on the dance floor. She was in some guy's arms, and they looked to be in love with each other. He was all over her, and I was jealous as hell. A couple times I tried to stand up so she could see me, but if she did, she didn't show it in any way. I'd changed a lot by then. I was what was euphemistically called a hippie. Those of you who are old enough probably remember. Long hair, clothes of the most ridiculous colors and beads. Lots of beads. God, I cringe when I think back on it. After a while, I noticed Sandy walking outside with another guy. I slipped away from my friends and followed her. When I got outside, neither Sandy nor the guy was in sight anymore. I had already turned to go back inside when I noticed movement in the car in the parking lot. I'm not a voyeur, but I needed to know, so I walked aimlessly around the parking lot until I got closer to the car. In the dim light, I could almost make out a guy who was happily watching Sandy in the back seat. It seemed like I should have been pretty upset about that, but this was in the 60s. You know, free love and all that. There was no connection between Sandy and me other than a high school friendship, so I guess all I had a right to do was be jealous, although the incident did upset me emotionally. I immediately left the concert and went home. A stupid thing to do, really. In retrospect, I would have been better off standing at the door and waiting for Sandy to see me when she finished her business and returned to the house. Ah, hindsight. If only. It was another year or so before our next meeting. It was at a wedding, and I was playing the role of best man at my friend's house. It was quite late in the evening, and I felt no pain. Well, you get the picture. I really didn't know Sandy was there, as I hadn't seen her all day. I hadn't seen much of anyone at all. I had spent most of the day focusing on two of the most gorgeous bridesmaids I had ever met. It was nearing midnight, and the party had moved back to the bride's father's house. My day's efforts finally paid off in full, and I somehow got both little beauties into bed. My first threesome. I doubted the girls would remember it the next day. If it hadn't been for Sandy coming into the room to get her coat, I wouldn't have remembered much of it myself. I don't know what she thought when she saw one girl riding me like a cowgirl and another sitting on my face, but surprisingly, Sandy recognized me. "Hey, Dave, stay out of my way," she said as she picked up her coat. It took a few minutes before I realized who the voice belonged to. As soon as it did, the girl sitting on my face sent airmail and fell to the floor. I don't know what happened to the other girl, but I struggled to regain my strength to run after Sandy. I was late and not my favorite best man because I didn't stop long enough to put on a shirt or shoes. Unfortunately, the parents of one of the bridesmaids were also at the party, and things got a little tense after that. So I headed home alone again. There was another fleeting encounter with Sandy, and it happened at my own wedding. As we stood outside the church while the photographer took the obligatory pictures, she stood in the crowd of onlookers. What the hell could I do? I couldn't leave my newlywed bride for 5 minutes to walk up and talk to some girl in the crowd. Somehow I feel like that wouldn't have been appreciated. Looking back, though, it was the best move I made that day. Like I said, this was in the days of free love, but I don't think my new bride realized that being married was not the same as being single. To put it bluntly, I soon discovered that she had a hard time standing up straight and keeping her legs together once she found someone to pay the bills. Needless to say, it didn't take long for me to pay the bills. Within a year, the guy who had been my best man went into the hospital, and I was on my own again, but with a criminal record for bodily harm. In case you're wondering, they may well have done it at the reception, but I do know they got together at her bloody hen party. I wish the person who told me hadn't spoken up sooner. It was a friend of my ex-wife's, and she told me while we were in bed together one night. Well, I needed an excuse. I tried to go around to as many of my ex-wife's friends as possible and damn near had a full house. I know it was to her advantage since she was pregnant at the time. I smiled when the paternity test showed that there was no way I could be the father. Wrong blood type, apparently. There were no DNA tests back then. Okay, I was on that damn subway train, and Sandy was in the next car. At every station, I stuck my head out and looked to see if she would get off, but she didn't, as far as I could tell. When the crowd thinned out a bit, I walked over to the car I thought Sandy had entered, but she wasn't there. Utterly discouraged, I changed trains and returned to my hotel for the night. That night, I didn't go to visit my parents as I had planned. I sat in my room and got drunk. Drinking doesn't solve anything, but it does take away the heartache. Oh yeah, if you believe that, you'll believe anything. It just dulls the senses for a while. As I lay in bed nursing a hangover for the next morning, an idea occurred to me. In big cities, people tend to drive during rush hour only when necessary. The main reason is to get to and from work, and they usually do it at the same time every day. So, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I stood at the foot of the escalator that led down from the platform where I had seen Sandy the previous day. My eyes were fixed on the binoculars, with which I studied every face coming down the escalator. Eventually, I got lucky. She was standing on the right side of the escalator so that people in a hurry could descend to her left. Her right hand rested on the moving handrail to steady her. I quickly changed position to see what I needed to see. It wasn't easy for me to locate her, but when I did, I noted with satisfaction that there was no glint of gold on her left hand where she held her purse. By then, Sandy was much closer to me. Lowering the binoculars, I saw a look of confusion appear on her face, which was quickly replaced by a smile when she recognized me. Without saying anything, Sandy simply stepped off the escalator into my arms. And here I am, holding Sandy's hand as she shouts profanities at me. This is the third time we've been through this damn procedure. Sandy always says it's my fault, but she's been in on it too. I don't mind her yelling at me. I've been told the pain is horrible. I'm just glad it's her and not me. I tried to suggest she get a C-section this time, but she insisted it would leave a scar and she'd be self-conscious in a bikini. God, she's still the most beautiful girl I've ever known. Life goes on.